All right. Give it a second to answer that question. And I would imagine many of you are not at the point of hold my coffee, and hopefully you're not at the point of I need to retire right now, no matter how many years you have in. But we can do this. And what we're going to talk about today is what it's going to take, what tools you need, what tools you have, and how you can start setting up your classroom. And then hopefully, if I get a chance to come back, we can start to talk about lesson design and unit design and things like that as we start to get into it and we see how things work. Okay. So for some of you, I can imagine that the way that you're thinking about hybrid learning at this point is that you're going to feel like there's so much going on in your classroom. It's going to be like you're riding two horses at the same time. And that's a difficult thing to do. And this is far more difficult than probably anything that we've done. But fortunately, we've kind of built some skills over the course of the last several months. And those skills are actually going to benefit you as you get into the hybrid learning model. All right. So our goals for today is to talk about what hybrid learning is. And you're going to hear me say the word high flex occasionally because what we're doing is actually a little bit more of a modified version of hybrid learning. With hybrid learning, we have students that are at home. They come into the classroom and then they flip-flop, or some come into the classroom and then they flip-flop for the next day. And you kind of go back and forth doing that. That's the hybrid model. Right. And that's what a lot of schools have actually been doing for quite a while during the pandemic. However, we're going to have a little bit different situation for some kids because there are going to be kids whose parents don't let them come to school because they don't want them to be physically in the building. We're going to have some kids that are quarantined, and so we're not going to see them physically for weeks at a time. And so this is kind of a modified hybrid. And that's why I'm kind of calling it high flex learning. And you'll see a little bit more about that as we go here. All right. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about what tools are necessary. We'll talk about what tools can be added. And notice I made the distinction between those two. There are tools that you are going to have, and it's actually a lot more limited than you probably think. But you can also add tools and add aspects to your teaching and to your lessons as you go. And we'll talk about what those are. We also need to think a little bit differently about how we're thinking of our classrooms and how we're thinking about teaching, right? There's one way of thinking where you basically are doing the same thing and whoever's at home does exactly what the kids are in school doing. But there are ways that we can actually capitalize on some of this setup, and we can actually make learning really good for people depending on where they are. All right, so we're going to talk about that. And today we're actually going to watch a couple videos of different models so that you can start to wrap your head around what this could look like in your classroom. Okay. So let's start off here. And this is the big question I think a lot of people have is, what is the expectation? What are we expected to do as teachers? How are we expected to conduct our classrooms? Are we expected to walk around the room? Are we expected to stay behind our desk? And all I can tell you is at this point, we know what we know. And what we know is actually laid out for us on this document, which you can't see on my screen, but hopefully you can see on yours. There it is. All laid out nicely for you in colorful Comic Sans. And you can see some frequently asked questions that the executive directors have actually answered for us. And if you get down to questions like 34 and 35, it really talks about what you're expected to do as a teacher. And one of those things does say that teachers, because of social distancing, we want to maintain social distance. So we want to be behind our desks for the most part. And that's really important because that's going to determine how we set up our desks and how we set up our tools and things like that. Okay, so that's the expectation. However, I believe it does also say in this document that if you are comfortable, you may get up and move to different parts of the room and things like that. But we have to make sure that we're maintaining that 6 feet of distance between our students and student to student as well. So we need to build that into our thinking as we talk about this, because life is not going to be as it was before the pandemic in our classrooms while we're doing the hybrid model. Okay. So the thing I want to point out to you right now is that there's more than one way to do all of this, right? And depending on your comfort level, you may want to add and subtract things from some of the models that you're going to see. But what I want to show you today is a few models of how hybrid learning can look, okay? And we're going to start off with a little video that I want you to focus not so much on the tools that they use and things like that, but I want you to focus on what the students are actually doing in this hybrid model, and what you think the kind of the values of the teachers are as they go about their business. So I'm going to switch to the video, and what I'd like you to do is you'll notice that some of the videos we're going to watch together, but this one I want you to watch, but I'm going to let you watch it on your own device. So you'll have to switch to you'll have to switch to your Nearpod tab or your Nearpod window in order to see this video, okay? And I'll give you, it's about 3 minutes and 12 seconds or so. I'll give you about 4 minutes to watch it, and then we're gonna reconvene, and I wanna kind of process the video just a little bit, okay? So without further ado, here's our first model. And I'll let you go ahead and give that video a look. Go ahead. All right, just give you a few seconds to finish up on the video there. All right, so what I'd like you to do is kind of take a little bit of time to process some of the things that you saw in the video. And what I want you to focus on here is, as I mentioned, I wanted you to think about some of the ways of thinking and the values that these teachers have in their classroom, and focus a little bit less on the tools. We'll do that later. And so what I'd like you to do in the next couple minutes here is I would like you to write down an observation of what you saw in the video. So on the Nearpod, go ahead and you can type down at the bottom, share your thoughts I want to know what it was that you observed in these teachers' classrooms. So take a minute to do that. All right. So once again, you'll have to go to the Nearpod window, and the code that we saw a little bit earlier was, we'll get back to that in just a second. The code was BSCXG. BSCXG for those of you that are not in. All right. So just a couple of things, just looking through some of these observations, students are definitely engaged. You know, obviously this is an elementary classroom, and this is going to be a little bit different than the middle school students that you are used to and things like that. But engagement is a key factor, obviously. All right. I noticed over here, someone said virtual students had the same materials as in person. And I think that that's one of the things that we're going to need to get good at too, is making sure that students that are at home have the same things that the students have in class. And unfortunately, many of the students at home are not going to have things like printers and things like that. So we need to really take that into consideration. One of the ways around that, obviously, is to use Schoology and use Google Docs and things like that to make sure that you know, everybody at home has the same things that what we have in school. All right. Noticed too, a big thing, teachers were engaging both online and the face-to-face students. And that's where it's going to feel like riding two horses again, where you're trying to engage both the kids that are sitting in front of you, and you've got kids sitting behind you or on your screen, and you're trying to get them engaged as well. And it's going to be really important to make sure that both of those groups feel like they belong in the class together. So it's going to take some practice. It's going to take some skill. But we'll get good at it as time goes on. Okay. So good stuff on the Collaborate board. Lots of different other comments and things like that. But again, really important that we're engaging students both at school and at home. So let's move on. And I'll get my Zoom controls back here. All right. Now, one of the things that you're going to hear me say many, many times, and there's a reason that I'm going to say it, is that a lot of what we're going to do really doesn't have a whole lot to do with technology, right? And as you'll see, we have most of the stuff that we're going to need down. Much of what we're going to need to do over the next several days is kind of start off, because we didn't start off the year in the classroom. We started off online. And so we've got to reestablish norms. And if you know who this little guy is down here, those of us who have been around for quite a while, I notice Rima knows who that is. That's Mr. Harry, or Dr. Harry Wong. Harry Wong is really big on establishing procedures and protocols and making sure that things are clear. And so that's one of the things that is really going to be the most important for us as teachers, is to set clear expectations for kids about what they're supposed to be doing, whether they're in school or online. Okay, so now here's why I say it's not about the technology. It is not about the technology because you have everything that you need. And a lot of times we get into that mode where things aren't going right, and the very first thing that we blame is the technology, because the technology can't argue with us, right? And unfortunately, we've got everything that we need. Now, technology, I will give it to you, they really, technology does not always behave the way that we want it to or expect it to. And we'll talk about encountering problems and things like that. But right now, you actually have everything that you need in order to do hybrid learning. First of all, minimum requirements. You need a webcam. The webcam could be one of those extra little ones that you got from the technology department, or your principals, that is sitting up on top of your monitor. That's one way that you can have a webcam. Another way that you can get a webcam is to have a laptop or a Chromebook sitting in front of you on your desk. All of those things have their own webcam. So you need a webcam, and hopefully that by this point you're used to using a webcam. The second thing you're going to need is a Schoology course, right? Schoology is going to allow you to give assignments to the kids at home, and also probably let your students in the classroom use those assignments as well, so that everybody's looking at the same thing, all right? And you need some Zoom skills. And the point of all this is for you to realize that everything that you need, you already have. It's just going to be using these things in a little bit different way and configuring things in a slightly different manner. All right. So those are the minimum requirements. And as you'll see as we talk today, you can start off with a very simple setup. And that's what I'm going to encourage you to do when you come back into the classroom. For the first couple lessons, even for the first week of lessons, start with the simplest configuration possible. Keep the number of tools down, keep the number of websites that you're having students go to at a minimum, for your own sanity and also for the students. They're doing something different here too, okay? So start simple. And then as you get good at things, add one element at a time. So you're gonna see in one of the later videos, teachers using a document camera, for instance. Add that on later, all right? So start simple, start with the minimum so that you can make sure that you're comfortable with what you're doing. And then don't add a whole bunch of stuff after that. Add one element at a time. Maybe it's one element a day, or one element even every class period. That might be a little bit quick too, but go slow, right? Go slow to go fast, as they said it at Dearborn High the other day, all right? And so adding some of those other things, like adding a second device, a third device, using a Nearpod or Desmos or whatever it is that you're going to use in your lesson. Let's add those a little bit at a time later. So some key considerations to think about. As we saw from the video that we watched, we want to make sure, and it's really important, that students that are at home have an equal access to the learning as the students that are sitting in your classroom. All right, so we're concerned about equity. We want to make sure that even, and especially the students that are quarantined or are sick, or their parents aren't letting them come to school, we want to make sure that they have just as much access to the learning as the students that do come to school. We want students to feel like they belong in the class, right? That's an element of every classroom. It's a little bit more difficult when you've got kids that can't see each other physically and things like that. But there are ways to do that. And as you'll see in one of the videos that comes up later on, sometimes we need to turn the camera around and show the class so that the students that are at home can see what's going on in the classroom, right? And not just us. We want to clearly communicate. We want to communicate expectations. We want to make sure that our directions are clear for both the students that are in our classroom and at home. And we want to communicate with parents as well, right? Simplicity is also something that I want to encourage you to use. A lot of teachers have really gotten good at using 8 or 9 different tools with their students. And unfortunately, if from a student's point of view, if you are in 6 different teachers' classes and every one of those is using 8 or 9 tools and only some of them overlap, that can get to be overwhelming for the kids, right? Not to mention for you to try and manage all of those things. So start simple. You can add things as you go, all right? Another thing, enlist the help of the other people in your room, whether you co-teach or you have a parapro, or whether you have students in your classroom that are pretty tech savvy that can kind of do things like man the chat and pay attention to the Zoom class and things like that while you're teaching, so that you don't have that extra thing to worry about. And they can just kind of raise their hand on behalf of all the students that are at home if there's a question while you're discussing something in front of the board or something like that. Okay. And then I think most importantly, at least as far as I'm concerned as a classroom teacher, you got to take care of yourself. If you're getting stressed, you got to back up a little bit. You got to back off a little bit. You got to reduce some things, because that makes you less effective when you're stressed out. So do as much as you can handle, and then just build from there. Okay. All right. So one of the things that we have found that teachers sometimes have gotten caught up with over the last several months is when you do have technical difficulties, and that's going to be one of the issues that you have in the classroom, not only with your own technology, but with students at home. And I know all teachers mean well, and we've heard from a lot of teachers that have contacted the help desk on behalf of their students and things like that. But there are going to be some problems that really aren't your problem to solve. There are people in the district that are there to support you. All right. So if there are technical difficulties, don't feel as a teacher like you have to solve those issues. You don't have the time to do that. You need to focus on your instruction. So what we want to do is help students learn how to get help themselves. All right. So in order to do that, you should have the help desk number ready for yourself, just in case you have an issue with the technology that's in front of you and things like that. And keep in mind, we've got a limited staff, and the staff actually sits, I'm not actually in my office. This is just a virtual background, but our help desk staff sits in the desks right behind my desk over here. And we only have a couple people answering phones. So, you may get a response that says, put in a help desk ticket or something like that. But that's really just to help kind of keep things organized and make sure that we can help you in the best way possible. But when it comes to students, you don't have to call the help desk on their behalf. You can have their parents call the number 827-8400 in order to get some help. So please use the resources that you have. Your job is to teach. Your job is not necessarily to solve all the technology issues and things like that. We do have support staff to help out with that. So let's not take on more than we need to. And you notice at the end there, there's my email address. You can always email me. I know I've heard from many of you. I can try and help you and work things out with you as well. All right. If it's a persistent problem with students, obviously you want to let somebody know too. Okay. All right. So what I want to do next is take a look at another model. And for this one, I want you to notice the tools that these teachers have available to them. And we're going to talk about them. And we're going to get back to what you need and how you can set up your room according to the way that they have their room set up. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes. This one's 2 minutes and 42 seconds. So I'll give you about 3 minutes to watch this video clip, and then we'll kind of debrief after that. All right. So once again, I'm going to ask you to just get on the collaboration board here. And I'd like you to just write down one takeaway from the video that you noticed. All right, so let's give it a couple seconds here. All right, some good stuff being added to the collaboration board here. I noticed one person, and we knew people were going to point this out. That little camera that's Mike, that kind of looks like Mike Wazowski, is kind of a camera on a stick, and it's really kind of cool. The teacher has a lanyard that she wears around, and the camera kind of follows her. That's like several $100s, and unfortunately, we're probably not going to probably not going to buy those. But we can honestly do without it. In fact, most of what you're going to do is, as I mentioned before, you're going to be sitting at your desk, and so you don't need a moving camera. And you can kind of go wide angle if you stand up at your board and things like that. So all those things are nice, but most of those things are not necessary. As someone else here said, more technology enhances the teaching, but it's not necessary, right? And so what we need to focus on is the teaching. All right, we need to focus on not so much what the tools are that we're using, but what it is that we're doing with students and what it is that we're asking them to do. All right, lots of interaction there. One of the other things that I noticed that's really kind of cool is sectioning off your classroom with painter's tape and stuff like that. Just from an experience point of view, you want to make sure if you're going to use painter's tape, use that blue stuff. Don't use masking tape and stuff like that. The janitors will not like you, and they will not like the fact that I showed you that video if you do. So use painter's tape if you're going to do that, to help kind of facilitate the routes in and out of your classroom and mark off areas that are off limits and things like that. Speaking of some of those practical tips, Lori Lintner and Chris Rosberry over at Dearborn High actually put together several slides for our presentation that we did with the Dearborn High feeder group the other day. And they gave some suggestions on things that you can do. So things like checking out an extra Chromebook, using an overhead projector, and I don't want you to pay attention to this. Don't use a music stand. You'll see that in one of the other videos. We don't want to set technology on a music stand or anything like that. They're not quite as reliable as a overhead projector cart if you can get one of those carts on wheels. But using painter's tape and things like that, even wireless headphones. One of the things that you probably noticed in some of the videos is some of the teachers had like a headset on. They had a microphone hanging from their lanyard and stuff like that. And we can actually do that with little things like AirPods. If you have AirPods at home, or even if you have the old Apple headphones that you can plug into your computer or something like that, those actually, many of those have a little microphone on it with the along with the volume and controls, and those things can help you communicate with the students that are at home, and also keep what's coming from them in your ears as opposed to broadcasting it to the class and things like that. Okay, so as I mentioned, at some point, maybe if I get the chance, I can come back and talk about some of the different ways that you can arrange your room, and I'll show you something at the end that should help you along the way as you think about these kinds of things and you think about designing your lessons. But one of those ways is to think about like stations around the room. And we've got to think about social distancing, obviously. We can't necessarily have all students congregated in one area and things like that. But that's a good way to get kids up and moving around and getting to different areas of physical space in the classroom and things like that. Okay, so those were some ideas from Lori Lintner and Chris Rosberry. All right. So last video of the day, this one is really going to kind of bring a bunch of this stuff together. And I apologize, but I want to watch this one together because I want to stop it about halfway through and make sure that we have time to process what's going on here. This video is going to show you one teacher who's kind of gone through several weeks of teaching like this, and you can see what she's added on and how she's added things on to what she's doing. All right, so I want to pay attention to that, pay attention to how she organizes her materials and things like that. And again, this is another model to help you wrap your mind around how this is all going to go. All right, so we'll watch this together. You can stay right here in this window. And again, I apologize. I know this is not the ideal way to share a video, but I do want to pause it about halfway through and just kind of debrief and kind of talk about things. So let me get started with the video. Make sure my sound is sharing. All right. And here we go with our last video. This one, again, is going to be a little bit long. That's why I want to stop it halfway through.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am in my classroom, and I'm going to show you today how I set up everything for my in-person and my virtual learners. I have students who are joining live from at home, and also I have students live in person. So I have to kind of arrange everything for a mix of both. So stick with me and we'll check it out. So this is my teacher desk, and I have my regular desktop computer that hooks up to my smartboard in the front, and I bring in my personal laptop too to do things like check my emails or put something quickly on Google Classroom because my desktop computer is tied up with the smartboard. So
all right, first of all, you notice there that she mentioned that she brought in her own personal computer. That's not something that you necessarily need to do. In fact, I would probably advise against it, because if you do have technical difficulties and things like that, and you call the help desk because of your personal laptop, they're going to have a much more difficulty trying to assess it and trying to help you fix it. So what I would do instead is use a Chromebook. If you're going to use multiple devices, use the materials that are already in school. For that reason, we can support it. We can even remote in certain circumstances and things like that to help you solve the issues that you have. So don't feel like you need to bring any of your own technology in aside from your headphones or something like that, okay? Everything that you need is already in your classroom.
So I use my desktop computer because not only am I trying to talk and see my students who are streaming live from home, but I also have my students in person that need to see whatever I'm trying to project. So I log in with two computers, which seems confusing, but it does seem to be working. And this works with Google Meet as well as Zoom. So you can see which works best for you. But you can see here that I've got the computer in the front, which is just a Chromebook, and this is showing me the view of my classroom. That is what I mostly use when I'm speaking with my students that are virtual and when I'm trying to have them see me. I use this computer if I need to do something where I need the touch part of the smartboard. So if I'm going to do a math lesson, let's say, and I want to write on something, or I want to show them a thing on Google Slides, I can project from here onto my smartboard. My in-person learners can see, plus I can screen share it to my virtual learners so they can see too. So let me show you a little example of what I mean by that. So if I want to do something like this, math, solve and share, I want to write with my markers on my smartboard. The only way for me to do this is to project with this computer, otherwise it won't exactly work. So what I do in Google Meet is I do present now, and I present my entire screen, because also another thing, the writing aspect comes on like a different layer. So if you just share the one tab, your students might not see the writing from their side. You'll still see it, but it's not really going through because it's just sharing that window. So make sure you hit entire screen. And once I share that, I'm able to see here, and I'll just turn my camera and show you guys. So you can see that I'm able to see everything here. I could take my smartboard, I can draw on it, and my students at home can also see this. I'm just going to show you what my students at home can see. Now what I'm using here is just it's actually a music stand. We found this in the closet, and there was a bunch.
All right, once again, I highly advise against using a music stand to hold your technology. If you've ever used a music stand before, use a cabinet or a shelf or something like that. But one of the things I want to point out is that she's doing a lot of really complicated things here. You don't necessarily have to do everything this way, but just turning the camera and having different devices facing different directions can accomplish what that little mic camera was doing in the other video. Okay, so keep that in mind as you look at this. She does have a very complicated setup, but some food for thought as we watch.
Bunch of extra ones, so they've been really helpful. I have my Chromebook on here. I've got my Hue document camera to kind of project anything that might be handwritten, and I'm just gonna take you a little closer. So you can see actually what the Zoom window looks like to somebody in it. So to my students at home, they're seeing what I'm projecting on the board. My students in person can see the whole projection full screen, and my students on the computer can see what I'm doing. If I write here, you'll see that it will write on the computer screen, and the students can get that same effect. And you can see that I can still see my students on the virtual learning. So what I do is I aim this way so that I'm able to talk to my in-person learners and still see my virtual learners there. I can see what I'm doing and what they see, and then it sort of pops up as we go, and I can still see my students here. So let's say I'm going to end the sharing now.
All right, now one aspect of that video is that she was actually writing on her whiteboard screen, and it was showing up on the computer that she was sharing her screen from. Things are a little bit more complicated in our classrooms, especially if you have, for instance, one of those Epson smart projectors. So you don't have a Promethean board, you have one of the new projectors up in your classroom. When you write on the screen on that does not actually transfer onto your computer. All right, so if you're going to use the Epson smart board, you need to take your computer and face the camera at you at the board. So in order for them to see any annotations that you're making, okay? Now, there are ways around that. If you have the old Promethean board, the one with the gray border around it, and you use the little gray stylus, when you use that, you can actually share your screen from your desktop computer, and they'll see all the writing that you do on your Promethean board, okay? Now, again, there are a couple other ways around that too. The Epson interactive projector, that pen, can also be used as a mouse. So if you use something like Cami or Google Drawings or even Microsoft Paint, or any one of those drawing apps or anything like that, where you're actually interacting with your computer using the stylus, then students that are seeing the shared screen can see it right there on the screen. Otherwise, you're going to have to turn that camera around and face your screen in order for them to see the annotations that you make. Okay, that's one of those things that it can kind of be hard to wrap our minds around, and doesn't work exactly the way we want it to the first time. And that's one of the reasons why, if you have questions about those kinds of things, you can reach out to me. I can kind of walk you through some ways and some options and things like that you have. You know, if you say, I want to do this, we can talk it out. We can maybe even come up with a different solution for what you can do, or I can suggest some things that that will allow you to do what you want to do. All right, so please feel free to reach out to talk about some of the configurations for things. Another thing, This is something that you're going to run into at some point in your classroom with, especially if you have multiple people on Zoom. You know, you may, for instance, have students in groups that are interacting with one of the people that's on the Zoom. And so you've created breakout rooms and you've got 3 kids in class and 1 kid at home on a Zoom, for instance, and all the, you know, the sound is coming through all of them and things like that. And you're going to have problems with things like interference with microphones and speakers and things like that. Just a rule of thumb when it comes to sound interference, that is, make sure that your speakers are not facing the microphone. So if you have speakers up on the wall behind you and you're sitting in front of it on a Chromebook, there's going to be an interference sound, right? So you want to either get on the other side of your speakers or direct the microphone in other directions so that you're not getting that loud whining sound that you have probably heard at some point in your life, okay? And that's one of the drawbacks to having multiple devices. One thing I recommend is if you are going to use multiple devices, turn off the sound and mute all of your devices except for one. Just use one for the audio input and output, and then mute the other ones and turn off the sound, and you should be fine when it comes to interference. Okay, so let's watch on.
All right, so I'm going to stop the screen sharing from the smartboard, and you can see that my students on the Chromebook, I can now see them bigger. I would be able to talk to them and see them. And another thing I'm going to show you is how I could share something if I want to review something that's on paper. So the Hue is a really great camera. It's so portable and it's light. So I put this right on this stand and it's been really helpful to me. With Google Meet, unfortunately, they don't have all of the same features as Zoom. So if you're using Zoom, it's a bit easier. But if you're using Google Meet, kind of a hack for this is to switch over your camera to make it into this camera. So your camera becomes the main window. You can see here, let me just, so if I wanted to display our math sheet that is paper version, I hook up my Hue camera and I actually make it my camera on the Google Meet on this Chromebook. So you can see that on my smartboard, because I'm still in the meeting, here is my camera that I just muted and blocked out. But here is this camera right here, and now you can see the math sheets up. So one trick that I always do is I pin it. When you pin the window, it makes it really big. So if I hit pin, I now get the full screen, and this is going to help my in-person learners because now they can see what I'm doing. And don't forget, the at-home learners can also see what I'm doing because I'm acting as a guest in the video chat. So I tell my students at home to also pin the window so it gets larger. And now I can write and I can move and everybody can kind of see. What I'll do is I'll usually turn around. That's why I have this like kind of moving cart. So I'll face this way, so I'm kind of out of the way for the students. I can still see my virtual learners plus my in-person learners, and everybody can see my document. So just a couple little tricks. I've also hooked up speakers to my cart here. I have some speakers right here on the side, and what I do with those is because sometimes I want to project videos and hear my students, I found that the echo was getting to be a little bit too much. So I will actually play videos from this Chromebook with the sound and with the camera from here. I will project it as a guest, one tab, and my students in person can hear because we have the loudspeakers instead of just the Chromebook speakers. And then my students online can hear better. And that eliminates kind of the running back and forth through the classroom, trying to mute one computer, play another. So if I share something, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So here's the window that I'm sharing from this Chromebook up here that I have the voice and the sound and the camera on. And you can see that it's big enough for my in-person learners to still see. And also the other thing I like is that my virtual students are still here on camera. I like to really include the virtual students so that my in-person learners can see them, plus I can keep an eye on what's going on, so it kind of helps me monitor both situations. So if I was showing, like, this is just our Google Classroom, but they can see it fairly large, it's easy to see. If I wanted to play a video or something on there, they would be able to see it in a large space. So here's a YouTube video I'm going to play so you can see how large it is for my in-person learners. They can see pretty well. The sound is now coming out of my speakers, so it's easy for them to hear.
Good. Now that we're done with that guy, today we're going to learn about...
What you can do too is just make sure that your presentation audio button is always selected. If you do that, then that way your students that through the video can hear through the virtual learners, they'll be able to hear fine. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. If you have any questions or you have other tricks on how you're teaching.
All right. So once again, that was kind of complicated. It might be a little bit overwhelming, but there's actually a simple explanation for the way that she had all of those things set up. One question that came up in one of the other sessions is, how is she showing what's on her screen on her Chromebook up on her projector? And again, it's a little bit complicated, but if you think about it, you can't actually connect your Chromebook to the smart board. What she was doing is she was signed in with multiple devices to Zoom. And so what she was doing is sharing the screen to Zoom to her desktop computer, which is connected to her projector, and she was projecting it from there. So again, things are, they can get a little bit complicated sometimes, difficult to work through and stuff like that, but there are solutions for much of the things that you want to do, okay? So just again, one more model for how things could look in your classroom. The thing I want to make sure that you're not walking away with is feeling like you have to replicate any one of these models. Again, there are lots of different ways to do it. There are lots of different ways that you can set up your classroom and things like that. Don't feel like any one of your classrooms has to look exactly like one of these. Because you don't necessarily have the same technology and the same tools, but what you have, you can do exactly what these teachers are doing. For instance, this one is the most complicated thing that we have, but she had everything that you have in your classrooms: document camera, multiple Chromebooks, she had her desktop computer and things like that. And that's all she was using. And she had a pretty robust setup, right? But as I mentioned before, start small. All right, don't start with a setup that looks like this and hope that it goes okay, because you're just going to get frustrated with it because you're going to run into problems. Okay. A couple things about signing into multiple devices. You can sign into the same Zoom from multiple devices, which is what she was doing. She was using Google Meet instead of Zoom, but you can do that with Zoom. And as I mentioned before, use a student helper. Students can be your camera people, right? If you just let the student kind of configure the Chromebook and be the person that follows you around and stuff like that, that's a good role for the tech savvy kid that's in your classroom and things like that. A note of caution, obviously, if you're going to use a Chromebook for Zoom and you are going to be the one signing into it, don't let a student walk away with that Chromebook just for the sake of like laws like FERPA and things like that. Because if you're signed into a Chromebook, that means they have access to your email and your grades and all those kinds of things, and we don't want to do that. So you can have a student sign in as themselves to a Zoom, and they can be your cameraman and things like that. So think about that and using enlisting the help of those students creatively as you go as well. Okay. I know that video was a lot, and you can actually watch it again if you want. Take a look at it, slow it down, replay certain parts and things like that, but it's there as your reference in the hybrid flexible learning course, which some of you have actually probably enrolled in by this point. Many people have not yet, but there's the code for the hybrid flexible learning course on Schoology that I created. I put this there for you. The district kind of asked me to put together some resources for you to help you in your thinking. It's not really like one of those, it's intentional too. It's not one of those like required courses where you're walking through step by step, but what it is kind of a, kind of a collection of helpful ways to think about things. And I eliminated a bunch of stuff that isn't relevant to you, and modified things so that it would be relevant to us as Dearborn teachers. So take a look at that. There are a few sections there. It is not, again, is not a required course, but you're going to find a couple of these videos there, as well as some things that I've written on things like tips, and also ways that you can start thinking about how you're going to structure your lessons and really kind of plan things from day to day. Okay, and it is called the Hybrid Flexible Learning Support course. Okay. All right. So with that, what I'd like to do, I know we've got about a minute left here. I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask questions or give comments. So I'm going to open up an open-ended question. Go ahead and type your questions that you have, or any comments that you have. And as I mentioned earlier on, you can always feel free to get in touch with me, email me, let me know what you're struggling with, what the instructional problem is that you're facing, and we can work through things together. I'm here to support you. Okay, so go ahead and take a second to do that. And I thank you all for joining me today. I know this was optional, and this is your planning time that you gave up to be here. So I hope that this was of some help for you as you looked at hybrid learning. All right, one question that has come up is there a way to avoid feedback in Zoom when there are two teachers in the classroom? That was one of those things that I did mention. Make sure that the speakers are not facing the microphones of opposite devices and things like that. So if one teacher is projecting sound one direction and the other person's microphone is facing that same direction, that's when you're going to get that feedback. The other thing is obviously physical distance. You know, if you can at all, go to opposite ends of the room or opposite corners of the room or something like that, that can help with some of that feedback as well. And as I mentioned, you may have students who are in a Zoom as well. You may want to ask them to mute their sound or something like that. And so that'll avoid some of that feedback too. All right, but that's sound is kind of complicated in that regard. So that's something that we have to really watch out for. Okay. All right, another question. Can't we just share our screens like we have been doing, projecting them on the board for in-person learners? You can do that. Again, it gets a little bit complicated if you want to write on the screen and things like that. If you're standing up in front of the board for those students that are there in person with you. But certainly you can use, if you want to use your mouse as your stylus and stuff like that, it's a little bit more difficult than standing up in front of the board and circling things and writing with a pen or stylus or something like that. So, but certainly you can do that. As I mentioned, the expectation is that you, for the most part, remain behind your desk anyway. So certainly an option for you. And remember, we want to start simple. Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments? I'll give you another minute to do that. For those of you that have to go, I know we were only scheduled from 1:30 to 2:30. Thank you for joining us once again.
Bob, I have another question. If we wanted to connect our personal laptop to the overhead projector, is there, like if we have like a MacBook and we want to connect it, is there an easy way where we can just unplug it from the desktop and plug it in to our MacBook? Or like an adapter piece with Amazon?
Yeah, the operative word there is going to be easy. Depending on what what ports you have on your MacBook and things like that. It may or may not be easy for you, but by all means, if you bring in your own device and you can figure out how to set it up, give it a try.
I need to know what kind of
so
port
you can certainly do that.
The Epson overhead actually uses. Like what port is it plugged into the desktop?
It's actually a USB. It's run through USB. It does, I believe, involve some drivers that you'll have to install. Right, so that's where easy starts to turn a little bit more difficult. Okay, I do not know if those drivers are proprietary or if they, if they're out there in the public domain. If you can just download them, you may need a license to do that. So again, it may get a little bit more complicated than you want it to. Whereas, if you just use your desktop computer or something like that, and then you shared your screen from your MacBook or something like that, that could help alleviate that problem. Okay, so. All right. So looks like there are no other questions. Again, thank you for joining me, and don't be a stranger. Hopefully I'll get a chance to return at some point and we can talk a little bit more about lesson planning and how to think about how to structure your lessons. But you'll find a lot of that material in the HyFlex or hybrid flexible learning course. Okay, so again, please reach out if you have questions. I'd love to hear from you through email if you are so inclined, and I'll try and get to you as quickly as I possibly can. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good weekend and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you, Bob.
All right, thank you, Rima.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, guys.